So last night at the ritual committee, a member told a story about a recent bat mitzvah service that took place on Shabbat morning. And during this service, during the hakafah, when the bat mitzvah carries the Torah around the sanctuary, a camera showed on Zoom the full sweep of the vast room, empty of people. Usually the camera's fixed facing the front of the room, only showing the bima and the ark to the Zoom congregation. And this member hadn't seen CBE's gathering place, our holy place, for an entire year since she was last in it. She was surprised by the sudden view of the empty sanctuary, and further surprised that it evoked in her a deep and painful longing, so strong that it made her cry. It has been 1 year. 1 year ago this week, we all scrambled to set up life at home for what we thought would be 2 weeks, maybe a month. At CBE, we raced to shut down the synagogue, to send the staff home, to set up Zoom accounts, to design remote Shabbat services, which we have then since enjoyed for an entire year. I did my first daily meditation on Facebook Live at 7:30 in the morning, 362 days ago. And many of you became CBE Connect volunteers soon after and began calling the entire community to check on each other, to make sure you had groceries and internet connections, and to see if you were sick. Quickly, New York became a truly frightening place. There was so much we didn't know, but we did know that people were dying. Ambulance sirens pierced the air here in Brooklyn, all day and all night. I remember reading an article by a woman who was sure that she got COVID in Prospect Park just by breathing the air in the park. It seemed possible. None of us knew what was possible or true. We held our breaths in building lobbies and elevators. We didn't fully know about or practice masking yet. We didn't know how to be safe. We were terrified of things like doorknobs and groceries and packages. We cheered at 7 p.m. every night for the heroes who saved lives and kept food on the shelves. We were in a life and death struggle together. And here we are 1 year later, still in that struggle. 530,000 Americans have died. 48,000 New Yorkers. Several of our members died of COVID-19, and scores of our relatives did. All of us who've experienced a death this year have mourned in empty Shiva homes. It has been so long. The toll has been so severe, and it is not over. An average of 7,000 new people tested positive for COVID per day over the last 7 days just in New York City. We've adapted to living under conditions that we would not choose, with anxiety, with loss, with boredom, with loneliness, with depression for a very long time. We've lost our freedom of movement. We've lost our ability to gather in person. And that's been painful for us. We've been limited to our homes, separated from each other, locked out of our empty sanctuary. Yet we have learned to endure. Many of you know that my father died 9 days ago, and that I got up from Shiva just on Wednesday. One of the gifts of death and mourning is that you begin to reframe a loved one's life. You get to see the bigger picture of who they were and begin to compile the lessons of the life they lived. As I thought about what to say in my father's hesped or eulogy, I knew I needed to talk about courage. My father was a very courageous man. He took a lot of risks in life and did daring things. But when I reflected, I realized that by far, his greatest courage was contained not in any of the public acts for which he was lauded, but in a very private, home-based courage, a courage of endurance. My dad was paralyzed for 40 years. And at first he expected to recover, but then he did not. And so he lived trapped in a body that confined him mostly to his home, that kept him away from most public gathering places, from most community events, that isolated him away from others most of the time, and trapped him at home in boredom and without freedom, and limited by conditions that he did not choose. Yet every day he woke up into that body and did what he had to do to live another day. He made routines for himself. He found small pleasures. He created moments of meaning. He called us all the time to tell us he loved us. He didn't complain much, and he did not give up. And he didn't really much despair. He took the limits imposed upon him with extraordinary courage, and he endured. He kept going and kept going and kept going for 40 years. Limited as he was, unable to impact the public sphere as he once had, unable to participate in community, unable to do work in the world, you might think, well, what was the point? But the fact that he kept going meant that he got to watch his children grow up and go off to college and make lives of our own. The fact that he kept going meant that he got to know his grandchildren and watch them grow up and become their own people. The oldest grandchild's now 21 and the youngest is 15. The fact that he kept going meant that he became wise. He became wise in that time and ever more loving. So that by the end, as we gathered around his deathbed, each of us beheld a burnished soul, shining with divine light. This week, we end the book of Exodus with a double portion, Vayachel Pikudei. Many commentators compare this week's parasha to last week's, suggesting that the construction of the tabernacle this week is a response to the building of the golden calf last week. Given the people's evident need to make something to pray to, well, why not give them a construction project that facilitates relationship with the divine instead of distracting from it? Studying the portion this week, 1 year into pandemic, just after Shiva, I see another dimension, a dimension about separation, about relationships, and about endurance. You see, last week, the people built the calf in a moment of deep panic. Moses had been gone for 40 days. They couldn't stand the separation. The text says, and when the people saw that Moses was so long in coming down from the mountain, they gathered against Aaron and built the calf. 40 days was a long time to wait. Remember when we thought that 40 days would be a long time? They couldn't stand it. So they gave up on the whole thing. They just didn't have the endurance to tolerate the separation. So this week, knowing that the people are going to have to endure not just 40 days at the mountain, but 40 years in the wilderness, 40 years of waiting in unpleasant conditions that they did not choose, God and then Moses, they do three things to help the people endure. They gather the people together. Vayachel means gather. They ask each person to give something of themselves, and they create a holy place, a place for God to dwell. The thing they build, as many know, is called the Mishkan. It's also called the tent of meeting, emphasizing that once inaugurated, it will be a place for the people to gather. And it is where they will meet God. In fact, when these instructions are first given, God tells them that God will dwell not in it, the Mishkan, but among them, Bitocham. That it is their very gathering that will keep God's presence near. Last week they panicked that without Moses and without God, they wouldn't be okay. But now the promise is that God will always be with them in a pillar of cloud and fire, and that Moses will lead them and gather them at this tent of meeting. As if to emphasize the point that the entire construction project is about relationships, that God dwells in relationships, the very center of the Mishkan contains a pair of cheruvim, or cherubs, winged angels whose name means closeness. The cherubim are facing one another over the Ark of the Covenant, looking into each other's eyes. And it is in the space between their faces where God's presence resides. Kind of like when we can look into each other's eyes on this Zoom screen. So here we are, 1 year in, still enduring conditions we did not choose. How do we keep going? How do we endure? Tonight, I propose that we do the very same 3 things that the Israelites did. And tonight, I'm going to ask you to do all 3. The first you're already doing. The first is gathering. When Moses gathers the people at the beginning of the portion of Vayachel, it is in an outdoor gathering, because remember, the Mishkan didn't exist. So the first thing they did was gather outdoors or in any way that they could. And that's what we do. We gather when we can outdoors, and we gather through this technology, and we gather in any way we can that's safe, but we gather. The second is to give something of yourself. And we have a very specific thing that we're asking you to give right now at CBE. It might not be what you expect. We want 5 minutes of your time. Maybe it'll take 7 minutes, I'm not sure, to fill out the CBE census. So if you haven't read about this or heard about this, I really want to impress it upon you now and ask you to do this. It came, I think, in an email this week. I think it'll probably come again. It's probably maybe going to be in the chat at some point or in the announcements. The idea is we want you to tell CBE about yourself, about your interests and your involvements in the community, about the relationships that are important to you. We want you to share a photo. This is so that we can connect you to each other while we're remote and once we're back together, so that we can know you better and help to meet your needs better and help you form groups with one another better and help connect you to opportunities to serve better. Please do this. This is a way you can contribute to our community being strong. And the third is to turn toward each other, like the cheruvim at the center of the Mishkan. That looks like getting involved in chesed and caring for each other in times of need. Or it looks like reaching out to someone you've seen at a Zoom service and going for a walk or striking up a conversation. Or it looks like joining a class or a committee to see if you might meet someone new. To turn your faces toward each other, to bring God into our midst. At the end of this double portion, all of the Israelites have given of themselves toward the tent of meeting, and all of their contributions have been accounted for. And the cheruvim are in position facing one another, and God's presence descends to dwell between them. But it's not time yet to go inside. The Torah portion ends. In fact, the book of Exodus ends without any person, not even Moses, entering the sanctuary. Did you realize that? The people can only gather outside still. And as the Torah says, Moses could not enter the tent of meeting, for Adonai's presence filled the Mishkan. Midrash Tanhuma teaches that Moses stood outside, afraid to enter the tent of meeting. The Holy Blessed One said, it's not right for Moses, since he made the tabernacle, to stand outside while I stand inside. So look, I'm going to call upon him to enter. And that's why the Midrash says that the next book of Torah, Leviticus, begins with the words, Vayikra el Moshe. God called to Moses to bring him inside. So here we are, 1 year into pandemic, still separated from one another, still standing on the outside of our tent of meeting, still getting choked up when we see a glimpse of our sanctuary that we cannot enter, still enduring. Vaccinations are here. Spring is here, but it's not over yet. There will be a time when we will finally be called to gather together in our holy space. Like Moses, we might be a little afraid then to step inside after all this time. but our great longing will be fulfilled. And our sanctuary will once again be our tent of meaning, and it will resound with our voices. We don't know how much longer we'll have to endure this. It will be longer than a day, but much less than 40 years. Until then, we'll keep going by gathering in the ways we can, by giving something of ourselves, and by turning our faces toward one another, making a place for God to dwell. Who knows? Maybe this experience of endurance will have burnished our souls just a little bit, making us more luminous for our children and for our grandchildren to behold.